November 3, 1944, 0340. The town lay in tatters, a ledger of blown facades and blackened rafters. Smoke still threaded the sky above Metz. The streets were a teeth-gritted maze of rubble and warped iron. Private First Class Michael Donovan waited on a ruin that once had been a bakery, the windows like empty sockets. His breath fogged in the chill. He had a Springfield M1903 across his lap, the stock worn where his palm fit. Around him, the company's snipers had become a thinning list. 23 men lost in the months since the battalion pushed toward the city. The number sat in the back of every man's throat. It tasted like ashes. Donovan's eyes kept returning to the scope, to the tunnel of glass that gave him such certainty and such danger. Through an 8x scope, the world narrowed to a place the size of a coin. It was precise, it was effective, it was limited. He thought of Chen's hand twitching where it had fallen, of Bradley's clean shock face, of the way silence had followed each crack of a rifle. He thought about Martinez beside him, younger and steadier than his years suggested, whose shoulder Donovan felt almost as a tether. They had learned, the hard way, that the Germans had begun to fight the snipers differently. Not lone men hidden in attics, but pairs working a system the Americans would come to call a double position. A shooter anchored where the scope could bring a head into frame, and a second man farther off axis, watching the flanks and the angles the scope could not see. One man fired, the other covered. One man baited, the other killed. A sniper's narrow vision, once an advantage, had become a trap. Donovan rehearsed the problem in his head in the same clinical way he checked his rifle. Imagine looking through a toilet paper tube. That's what an 8x scope did to your world. It flattened everything outside the circle into blind, uncertain dark. The double position exploited that blind. You could see a boot or a face, but you could not always see the hand that pinched a trigger from an angle 2 or 3 feet off. Donovan had watched a man rise, take aim, and vanish before the report could be traced. He had watched partners fall because the shooter's peripheral vision was missing. He had felt the shape of the answer before he could name it. It came not as doctrine, but as an irritation, a peripheral glance at a shattered mirror in a window frame, the way light bent around broken glass. If the scope narrowed, he thought, give the scope more edge, give it a reflected edge. Before dusk, Donovan was crawling toward a hotel now half a mound, the staircase a ruin of concrete and plaster. He moved with the practiced, patient menace of a man who had learned the difference between haste and death. Martinez shadowed him, youth caught between curiosity and the kind of fear that tightened the jaw. Inside the hotel's ruined lobby, they found what they needed. A hand mirror, about 4 by 6 inches, its wooden frame splintered, but the glass whole enough to hold an image. They huddled in the cold light, breath steaming. Donovan set the mirror beside his canteen, then moved to fetch his tools: a coil of wire, scraps of leather, a roll of electrical tape. He had taken the mirror because he believed the solution would be low technology and fast. That belief had been born out of necessity. No resupply ran snipers' extra parts, and from habit. Frontline men improvised or they died. For Donovan, the work that night was a ritual. He remembered the way his father had sharpened a scythe on a farm in Pennsylvania. Careful angles, little taps to set a blade. This was the same economy of motion. He cleaned the edge of the mirror with a scrap of shirt, then wrapped the back with tape so the glass would not rattle. He attached a leather strap with wire, looping and twisting until the assembly sat rigid. He tested the mount against his cheek. The mirror, when angled, offered a slice of side view that did not require moving his head. It was crude, it was ridiculous, it was, he hoped, useful. They called it the mirror modification, only because someone in the mess later liked the simplicity of the name. At the time, it was merely Donovan's hack, a small glass plate lashed to a leather strap so that a sniper could see a sliver of the alley beside his line of fire without exposing himself. The idea boiled down to one sentence: give the scope a peripheral eye. Donovan showed Martinez how to set the mirror on the cheek weld. "Angle it so you can see the doorway," he whispered. "Not straight out, sideways. Keep your head still. The glass should tell you if a man's stepping into view before he gets in the scope." Martinez practiced in the dem, angling the mirror until a sliver of the street appeared. For a brief, absurd moment, he and Donovan laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was almost obscene that a hand mirror could be the difference between life and death. The CTA came then, a short, practical break from the story, and a small request that would not have mattered to men in war, but mattered to the telling of their deeds decades later. If this account is pulling you in, like and subscribe, and stay with the story to the end. There is more to how a cracked scrap of glass changed a fight than first appears. They carried the mirror into position that night with no ceremony. The bakery's arched doorway made a tidy blind. Donovan lay prone, breath steady, where he could see the corner of Rue des Tailleurs. The mirror hugged the right side of his cheek. Through the scope, he saw a slice of street and an impossible clarity. Through the mirror, he saw a movement to the side, a twitch of a sleeve where nothing should have been. It arrived as a small set of details, a glove, the shine of a watch, and then as a certainty. Donovan did not lift the rifle before the report, but the rifle found its target with the quiet, terrible exactness of trained iron. The first German who fell that November night was, by all accounts, simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was in a double position that favored his partner when they expected the Americans to keep a certain tunnel of view. He had not expected glass to betray him. What followed in the hours after that first shot was a rapid entering change. Donovan and Martinez, working together, used the mirror to sweep a narrow grid of alleys. They communicated in clipped notes, in preset signals. A finger to the lip meant hold. 2 taps on the stock meant move. A soft cough meant enemy sighted. The mirror allowed them to see the man that otherwise waited in the scope's blind. Over 4 hours, the sweep took 6 German snipers. The math was small but decisive. 6 snipers removed from the enemy's field operations in a single night changed immediate patrol behavior. By dawn, the mood in the company had shifted from taut fear to a quieter, stunned relief. Word moved like flame along a dry hedge. Sergeant Frank Wilson, who had been a hunter back home and had an instinctive faith in tinkering, saw the mirror and immediately understood. He wrapped tape differently, adding a small leather pad to the strap to reduce slippage. Corporal James Bradley's friends took notes. Martinez began showing other men the angle that mattered. Whatever Army regulation frowned at modifying government equipment, whatever paper trail might have been ruined by a man's tweak, did not exist under the rubble and the cold. The imperative was simple: keep your men alive. The adoption went from personal to tactical with dizzying speed. Within days, the company's snipers were testing variants. Some used a wired mount to fix the mirror to the scope side. Others favored the cheek-strapped version for quicker repositioning. They experimented with mirror sizes. 4x6 stayed the favored balance for being large enough to give a meaningful slice of view, but small enough to avoid reflecting sunlight in a way that would betray a position. The materials were always scavenged: electrical tape, a strip of leather from a boot, a bent paperclip for a hinge. Donovan found that the mirror changed more than just the geometry of sight. It altered behavior. Men who had been confined to the rhythm of a narrow tunnel discovered they could watch the periphery without moving. They became less jumpy, more patient. They began to trust the patchwork solutions of each other. That trust hardened into a quick, necessary camaraderie. If you had his back, he would have yours. Yet the change raised questions Donovan did not want to ask aloud. He had never been a man to court attention, but the work of changing equipment carried a technical and an ethical risk. Soldiers were supposed to use equipment as issued. There were regulations about modifying ordnance and weapons. There were men who would not take kindly to improvised hacks, even if those hacks saved lives. Donovan folded the doubts under the broader fear. He could face a court-martial. But curves of morality in war often bent toward expedience. He could not unsee Chen's slack fingers, could not unhear the silence that followed each rifle crack. Guilt was fuel. Captain Robert Hayes came to see for himself. Hayes was a battalion-level officer, not given to theatrics, who had earned his place by moving calmly through chaos and making decisions that did not court heroics but minimized waste. He watched Donovan and Martinez work the mirror, watched a demonstration that ended with a suppressed, decisive report. He said little in the moment. Later, in a battered office where maps hissed from damp, he told Donovan that any man who kept his men alive would find some protective shadow in command if the results mattered to the mission. That hint of sanction mattered as much as any written order. News of the mirror crossed unit borders. By November 8th, and then November 12th, after after-action reports and quick, informal demonstrations, other companies in the 5th Infantry Division were fielding copies. The enemy adapted when they could. They tried to vary patrol patterns, set counter-ambushes, and test whether the mirrors left a tell. They could not immediately put a price on every angle. Adaptation takes time, and time was what Donovan's men bought. The fight around Metz that month was not decided by glass alone. Battles were a weave of shellings, infantry advances, and supply lines. But in the small, brutal calculus of sniping, where one hidden shooter could blind a patrol and turn a lane into a death trap, the mirror rewired that calculus. Donovan's modification did not win a war. It changed a fight, and sometimes in war, changing the fight was all the men asked of a single night. The technique's movements beyond the company were part gossip, part demonstration, part necessity. Sergeant Wilson's variations spread in talk and by hand. Martinez wrote a note that circulated with a crude drawing. The work made its way up channels that were less official than human. A captured photograph, a letter home, a sergeant who mentioned it in passing to a visiting officer. By January 1945, formal attention arrived in the shape of a testing session at a Belladine proving ground. Military technicians with their own clipboards and spreadsheets wanted to evaluate the modification under controlled conditions. They would strip it of the horror and immediacy of a bakery rooftop and measure it like a device. Donovan stood near the proving ground's testing area and felt smaller than he had on any rooftop. The mirror lay on a table between measuring devices and neatly labeled forms. Engineers prodded and calculated field of view changes, wrote down degrees of angle, and nodded at the crude ingenuity. There were minutes that felt gratifying. The men asked for him by name to explain why the strap needed to be short, why the 4x6 had been the best compromise. There were other moments that felt like erasure. When the engineers convened a procedural report, the language slid from Donovan's name into neutral phrasing. Field expedient peripheral device, and optical peripheral attachment. A technical evaluation could not, the papers suggested, be pinned to one individual in a document meant for procurement and doctrine. The solution was made proper by anonymity. It was a quiet, bureaucratic death for Donovan's claim. The device would be adopted in doctrine-sounding language, and the man who had lashed tape to a mirror in a ruined hotel would, officially, be a footnote at best. He understood the shape of that erasure and felt a complex relief. His conscience finally could rest. His name would not be paraded by committees he did not trust. But there was a sting nonetheless, not of vanity, but of the human habit to remember faces for actions. After the war, Donovan returned to a factory job in Pennsylvania. He married, had children, learned again to pick up a different rhythm of living. He did not lecture at reunions. He did not file for recognition. He kept a scrap of mirror wrapped in oilcloth in a toolbox, sometimes taking it out and running his thumb along the taped edge, as if to reassure an old part of himself. He answered letters from men who had survived the Metz sweep and thanked him for a life returned. He kept their photographs in a shoebox. In 1987, a historian poking into the files of the 5th Infantry Division came across fragments. A field report, a proving ground evaluation, a stack of veterans' correspondence. The historian followed the trail, found Martinez's terse sketches and Sergeant Wilson's notes in a veteran's album, and began to assemble the story that the paperwork had not been written to tell. By 1989 and 1992, magazines and local papers printed the little rescue of glass and tape as a human vignette, a small counterpoint to grand strategy. Hayes received letters of gratitude and, in old age, visited Donovan in a modest house where the front yard had a small flag. Hayes gave Donovan a look that said what the papers had not. Some things mattered more than official credit. Donovan died on June 7, 2001, quietly, with the shoebox of photographs under his bedside. The men who had lived because of a strip of mirror called him friend. They told stories at funerals and reunions, their memories folding around names and small acts. The mirror, ridiculous and humble, had been an instrument of survival and a symbol
of a particular moral, that the line between cowardice and courage often ran through improvisation, through the willingness to break a rule if the cost of not breaking it was a friend's life. There were questions that remained. Had the Army institutionalized the idea at the expense of the individual? Yes. Had the device been properly tested and improved? Yes. Did Donovan's name appear in official doctrine? Not in the way he might have wanted. That tension between utility and recognition was the quiet part of the story that historians would keep returning to. It was the reason men like Hayes and Martinez felt compelled to write in their later years, to sign letters, and to nudge archivists. On the morning after the Metz sweep, the bakery roof was a litter of footprints and the flaking ash of a city that had been. Donovan cleaned his mirror with the hem of a shirt and slid it back into its leather wrap. He thought, briefly and without flourish, of the mirror as a small biography of the war. Not heroic in the polished sense, but the sort of small, repeated ingenuity that made the difference between a man walking home and a family marked by absence. The mirror returned in memory as both tool and metaphor. In quiet years of reunion letters and the historian's footnotes, it stood for peripheral vision, the ability to notice what official sightlines missed, and for the anonymous labor of those who had to do the dirty, precise work of survival. Men nodded at that notion and accepted that, in history's ledger, one person's contribution would sometimes be buried under words like field expedient or peripheral attachment. But for those who were there, Martinez, who kept the photograph, Wilson, who told the story in the mess, Hayes, who stood as a shield in paperwork, Donovan was neither anonymous nor fictional. He was a person who had stared at a small piece of glass and decided to bend human ingenuity around it. Night in Metz had shown that sometimes the most ridiculous tools were the right ones for the right problems. The mirror was ridiculous because it looked nothing like a weapon. It was real because it saved lives. And what it left behind, beyond the altered kill ratios and the technical reports, was a handful of men who kept returning to its image, a small rectangle of glass, taped and battered, that gave a man an eye at his side. The fighting around Metz continued beyond the November sweep. The modification held on where it could. Enemy tactics shifted, counters were attempted, and the battalion adjusted in turn. Yet Donovan's mirror had altered the rhythm of certain patrols long enough to make a statistical difference in survivorship. That, in the calculus of war, had weight. The story of a man and a mirror was not a tale of glory. It was a tale of necessity stitched to small invention and
of how frontline improvisation moved into the machinery of a larger force. It was also, in its quieter hours, a story about memory, how some names are flattened by forms and footnotes, and how others survive in envelopes, in returned photographs, in the weathered signatures of veterans. Donovan's name lived in that shoebox, in the letters he received, and in the memory of those who had known the night when glass turned into a strange kind of sight. As winter seeped into the ruined streets beyond the bakery, the men wrapped their rifles and folded their maps. Donovan walked away from the rooftop that had become a temporary chapel of survival, the mirror safe in his pocket, the smell of cordite lingering at the back of his nose. He had no illusions about medals or records. He had, instead, a small private assurance that improvisation on the line had stopped men from falling. That, he thought as he descended into the dark alleys, was enough for now. He slipped between collapsed storefronts and the skeletons of awnings, boots sinking in the half-frozen mud where summer had once been pavement. The city smelled of snow and smoke and the faint, stubborn sweetness of spilled sugar that had survived the oven's ruin. Donovan kept his hands in his pockets until he reached the canteen, then drew out the mirror to check the strap on his pack. The glass caught the pale sun and sent a thin, awkward reflection across his palm, a sliver of bright that belonged to a world that had not yet sorted itself into maps and casualty lists. Inside the billet, the others were trading cigarettes and jokes that landed soft against the memory of Metz. Wilson told the same story he had told since the rooftops, his voice finding the familiar cadences that made men laugh to keep from thinking. Martinez sat on the footlocker with the photograph folded in his breast pocket, fingers worrying the edge of the paper, as if he could smooth the past into something manageable. Donovan laid the mirror on the table and watched it for a long time. It looked like an accident that had learned to be useful. In its battered leather wrap it was no more noble than a splintered spoon, and yet something about it made the men lean closer, as if proximity lent meaning. Hayes, who still kept his paperwork in a shoebox under his bunk, reached for it briefly and then let his hand fall away. "Field expedient," he said, the phrase as much a prayer as a classification. "We'll write that down. Someone'll put it in a report." "Someone will write field expedient and the typesetter will call it permanent," Donovan answered without humor. He had no taste for the slow commerce of credit. The nights after Metz had carved their own ledger into him. He had seen faces that did not return from the sweep. He had watched men steady themselves on the notion that small inventions could tilt a night away from a grave. That was reward enough, and always too much. They moved out in the second thaw. The line pushed east and then west, the front an organism that breathed and bled and kept moving. Orders came in bundles, and the battalion packed around its necessities. Rifles, canned rations, the cardboard of letters folded until corners softened. The mirror went into Donovan's vest whenever there was a chance, and when it did not, someone else, sometimes Martinez, sometimes a new man with eyes too young for the cold, would pocket it and carry the practice of looking sideways, until the habit settled into the unit. On a reconnaissance near a ruined mill, the mirror did something it had not been designed to do. It became a messenger. They had advanced beneath a low sky, a thin line of men who smelled faintly of boiled coffee and the tired oil of weapons. A machine gun nest waited where the map said there was only rubble. Donovan was at the front when the burst came, a hot, chopped sound, and he felt the world rearrange itself into two tasks: move and keep others moving. He pressed himself against the masonry and drew the mirror, angling it to catch the glance of a man clearing a cornice 3 meters away, whose eyes were below the ledge and whose stance would have made him a target had he straightened to peer. The reflection gave a whisper of motion at an angle the line could not see. The man changed his step. The bullet grazed stone instead of flesh. After, when shells sang and men cursed and the world smelled sharply of iron, the survivor slid down and held a hand up as if in benediction. "Thanks," he said. Not for the glass, for the act of someone else noticing the thin angle that kept him whole. Those small survivals stacked up like bricks. They did not become fame, but they did become a rhythm to the battalion's days. Hayes kept filing his notes and sketches into his shoebox. Martinez added names to a typed list and pasted the photograph in the margin like a hymn. Wilson told the tale of the mirror at the mess and disappeared into the laughter that softened it. Donovan simply kept the glass wrapped and, when he could, shut himself into the quiet that came at dawn, before patrols, a time when the world seemed to permit private reckonings. Recognition, when it arrived, came in the bureaucratic language of caution. An officer from logistics visited one afternoon and asked for a demonstration. He took measurements as if the mirror were a new piece of ordnance, making diagrams that turned the intuitive into the calculable. Standardization, he said. If we can reproduce this, retrofit it, we can save men. He meant well. He spoke of memos and trials and the slow institutional machinery that could transform a thing into policy. Donovan, when asked to demonstrate, wrapped the mirror and handed it off. He did not enjoy the salesmanship concealed as science. He had seen too much improvisation turned into formula until nuance was ground away. Still, someone in a higher office liked the report. A small order came through for field expedient kits, with spare mirrors, and men from the unit were sent to instruct others on the practice of angling sightlines. The device's face, smeared now with fingerprints and the fine, persistent dust of the road, was copied into engineering notebooks, footnotes, and appendices. Somewhere between the rooftop and the papers, the mirror lost its intimacy and gained availability. It was both gratifying and strange. Gratitude shrank to a human scale in his chest, relief that other men would be kept alive, and something else tightened, the private portion of a story that refused to submit to office hours. When the news finally came that Winter would hand the field to a different campaign, they packed away a season of memory. The bakery in Metz remained a shell, but the men left a handful of their small objects behind. A thermos, a dog tag, a worn photograph tucked beneath a shard of broken tile. Donovan wrapped his mirror and put it in his pocket before the trucks took them on to the next stretch of road. He could imagine, with a clarity that made his hands steady, the mirror in a catalog somewhere, a diagram between pages about fieldcraft. He did not imagine his name on the margin. War ended for them in a slow folding of orders and a careless, miraculous accumulation of time. There were furloughs, then demobilization, then the heavy business of returning. Donovan kept the mirror through each rotation of trains and ships. It lived in the same leather wrap and the same pocket, and at night he would open it and see himself as he had become, a face with thin lines drawn where laughter and grief had resettled. The mirror bore scratches like other men bore letters. It held, against its glass, an inventory of minor wounds. Back home, the world was both the same and not. Streets that had known ration lines now carried babies and newsstands. Factories hired men who had once learned to read the weather by the turn of a corner. Donovan found work at a foundry, hands roughened in a different kind of labor. The mirror spent winters chained to the bottom of a trunk in a shared boarding house, a talisman against forgetting, and an embarrassment against a life that was supposed to be ordinary. They began to gather, years later, in the small rooms of veterans' halls and on the benches behind the bakery, where the city had rebuilt its ovens. Men who had been faceless in the lists of the war found themselves tutors of memory to younger ears. Hayes wrote a piece for a regimental bulletin that catalogued innovations and missteps. Martinez wrote long letters to an archivist in a nearby town, his script careful and stubborn, as if the act of writing could guarantee preservation. Wilson, who had always told the story well, insisted Donovan tell it himself. "You'll make it sound less like something someone did on purpose and more like what it was," he said. Donovan resisted the stage. He preferred the margin. But at a reunion with coffee that cooled too quickly and a cake someone had burnt in an oven that remembered the war as a rumor, he unwrapped the mirror on the table.
It drew attention like a small private relic. Men leaned forward. The room went quiet in a way that made his throat ache. Silence was not applause, but a kind of giving. He told them the facts without decoration: the city, the rooftop, the difficulty of seeing past the column of smoke. He said the words as one reports to a ledger, then folded them into the room like a cloth. There were questions. How had he thought of it? Whom had he seen? Who else might have used such a thing? He answered as he always did: presence, necessity, the tilt of a plan made in the moment. And when he finished, Martinez reached across and put his hand on the mirror's worn edge. "You saved men," Martinez said. The phrase was simple and absolute, and the men clustered there as if that simplicity could tend their unquiet. Recognition trickled in odd forms. A small museum in a nearby town asked to borrow the mirror for display. Hayes called that an honor, and Martinez called it a correction of sorts. Donovan let them take it for a season. He visited once to stand across a rope and see his life reduced to a label, the font of which looked embarrassed beside the object. He read the caption: "Field expedient, improvised by unknown trooper." He could have argued. Instead, he walked home and sat on his porch and thought of the rooftop and of the man who had kept breathing because someone else had angled a small square of glass toward him. Time made certain things tender. Men grew older and patient with the ache of not being properly recorded. They wrote letters that sometimes turned into book chapters. Historians came with clipboards and an appetite that was respectful but mechanical. They wanted dates and diagrams and the kind of precision that chewed on anecdote with polite teeth. Donovan gave them what he could: names, places, the ways men moved when they went quiet. When they asked why he had not patented or registered or tried to make the mirror his, he laughed with a sound that had no mirth. "It wasn't mine to keep that way," he said. "If it saved one more man because someone copied it, that was enough." There were nights, decades later, when he would take it from the shoebox and hold it to the lamp, and look at the glass, but at the man in it. A grandson had once asked if the mirror was magic. Donovan said it was not, which was truthful and then incomplete. "It makes a small truth visible," he said finally, because that was the kind of magic he believed in, the one that did not alter the world so much as help you notice it. He died with the mirror under his pillow. They found it there when they pulled the bedclothes aside, the leather wrap soft with age, the glass smudged with the last prints of a hand that had tended it like a companion. The shoebox of Hayes was passed along. Martinez's photograph was turned over in the hands of men who had become nephews and neighbors and custodians of memory. Wilson told the story at the funeral because that was what he did. He told it as if telling could reenact the mercy, and men listened because they needed to. In the archive that would eventually accept Donovan's mirror, a curator wrote to the family with the grave politeness of someone trained to perform cares. The mirror was catalogued, its history recorded with the care of a species that tries to hold the past in brackets and numbers. For a while it was behind glass, its leather wrap displayed like a relic in a case. Visitors read the small plaque and nodded, and children pressed noses against the pane and looked for the secret angle that could bend the sight of a man from exposure to safety. But objects do not only belong to museums. They live in envelopes and under floorboards and in the pockets of soldiers who have learned to keep their eyes wide at the margins. Donovan's mirror kept turning up in letters, a sketch here, a photograph there, and in the private pantheon of objects people touch when they mean to remember. It was no longer only a device. It had become a shorthand for the improvisations that war required, a modest, stubborn clarity in a world that had too often mistaken force for foresight. Winter came back to Metz, years after the men had left. Snow disguised scar and ruin with the same indifferent hand it used elsewhere, and someone, a historian, a volunteer, a concerned young curator, cleared the bakery's rubble and laid a small plaque beside a paving stone. They wrote the words with the respectful bluntness of commemorations, "In memory of small mercies." It was not much and it was not nothing. For men who had known the tilt of that glass, it was a place to stand and, for a moment, to see themselves reflected in a city that had once been an edge. The mirror, when the archives eventually lent it back to a traveling exhibit, crossed oceans and glass cases and cities that had no memory of Metz but were full of their own ruined mornings. People looked at it and then at one another, as if the object asked something of them. Will you notice? Will you bend your sight toward the margins? Donovan's name sat now in a small line in a catalogue, accompanied by the familiar caveats of history. Not original in doctrine, but influential in practice. Men like Hayes and Martinez had ensured that his trace remained legible. In the end, what he had wanted, if one could call it wanting, was modest. He had not wished to be carved into stone or to parade it in a column. He had only wanted, in that most human way, that the men whose breath had been kept by small devices might live to sit with their children and tell stories that ended with names. The mirror had not won medals. It had, however, bought a handful of evenings, an accumulation of letters, and a photograph tucked into an old man's pocket. Those were its laurels. And somewhere, in a house that had learned the rhythms of absence and return, the mirror rested on a shelf until a young hand reached for it. The hand was unsteady, curious. The boy, a grandson of someone who had been there, turned the glass and saw not only a face, but the small room of choices that make up a life. He looked up at the old man beside him, whose voice had the accustomed slope of stories. "Tell me again about the rooftop," the child said, and Donovan's son, or the son's son, a keeper of the last line, smiled and began, and the glass caught the light and answered with a tiny, unwavering reflection. The old man set the mirror on his knee and turned it so the light from the window pooled on the glass. He spoke slowly, the way you do when you have been asked to name something that is not yours to change. "It was not grand," he said. "It was only a roof and a cold wind, and men who had learned to keep their hands busy so their mouths would not remember to tremble. Donovan had the glass in his pack because he liked to see things cleanly, without the hurry. He would take it out sometimes and catch a sliver of sun and hold it up so the boys could laugh at the way their faces shifted. Those were small, dangerous luxuries then." The boy leaned forward until his chin nearly rested on the old man's wrist. "What did he do on the rooftop?" "He stood near the chimney," the old man said, and his voice took the pace of a memory being measured against the present. "Shells had fallen that morning. The stones still smelled of smoke and wet. A man, Hayes, I think, had climbed up to find a way that did not go through the street. He froze there, looking at the wrong place, the wrong edge. Donovan saw him. He saw that Hayes was looking where the world would make a story of heroism, and not at the small place where one could step and be kept. So Donovan lifted the mirror, angled it, and sent a patch of sky toward Hayes's face. It was nothing, truly, only a bit of light, like a summoned piece of day. Hayes blinked. He moved. A roof tile a handspan from where he'd stood gave way an instant later. The boy's eyes widened as if the glass in his grandfather's hands might show the tile splitting even now. So the mirror pushed him? "It did nothing that force could claim," the old man answered. "It was like telling someone to look where their feet would be instead of where their heart feared to go. The mirror made notice possible, that is all." Hayes went home to his son because someone chose to alter the angle of seeing. They sat in the comfortable pause that follows a story that is both simple and immense. Outside, the street was a small river of ordinary life. A cart creaked, a woman called a child's name, a dog barked twice and forgot what had startled it. The mirror lay between the old man's palms like a secret offered back to daylight. "Did Donovan ever tell them about himself?" the boy asked, picturing the man who had held lives in the span of a hand. "Donovan had been a private man," the old man said. "He had no appetite for being fixed in marble. He liked to fold his small mercies into the day and leave them hidden where they might keep someone's breath a little longer. He wrote letters to a few men, sometimes in the tremulous cursive of a hand that had learned to steady over a lifetime of small tasks. He wrote about bread and rain and the way the light made the coffee look like a promise. The letters were kept like talismans and read aloud on cold nights. That, too, was a kind of mirror. The boy traced the rim of the glass with a fingertip. Why doesn't it show anything weird, like ghosts? Perhaps because its work was never to show what is not there, the old man said. It only made room for what is. For a man to see where the next step is, that is miracle enough. People imagine miracles as thunder, but most of them are the quiet rounding of a corner. He told the boy then about other scenes, small scenes stitched together. Martinez tying a shoelace for a man not his brother. A baker in Metz leaving a loaf by the door for a hungry sentry. A curator in a city across the sea writing a letter that smelled faintly of dust and kindness. Sometimes Donovan's mirror had been the cause, and sometimes the witness. Sometimes it was folded into pockets and forgotten until a sleeve reached for it and found a habit of remembering. The old man spoke of the shoebox and the photograph, of Wilson who told stories because telling named the mercy and thereby kept it from being lost. When he finished, the boy sat a long time with the glass tilted so the room's light lay like a language across his face. He saw not only himself, but the thin map of choices, the hesitations, the small courage in his grandfather's profile. The mirror's reflection did what it always did. It gave clear, undramatic sight. "Will you keep it?" the boy asked at last. "I will," the old man said, and there was no boast in the answer, only a steady assent. "And you, when you are older, you will find that the thing you keep is not the object, but the way you learn to look. You will find 100 other roofs. Some will be canvas, some will be tile. You will learn how to angle light." Years passed as the slow and ordinary years do. The old man grew more accountable to memory than to plans. The boy grew into the sort of man who remembered to tell stories at funerals and baked bread sloppily on Thursdays. The mirror moved with them when houses emptied and when rooms were rearranged. Sometimes it was on a mantel, catching accidental suns and turning them into small truths. Children were born and were told the rooftop story in the half-light of bedrooms. Faces in photographs continued to sit in wallets and pockets, and the shoebox of haze had new layers of paper and new notes pressed between. The traveling exhibit that had once shown the mirror behind glass now contained other objects of modest consequence. The mirror itself had outlived the need to be a curiosity, and had become, for its keepers, a domestic liturgy. Late one summer, after the old man had gone the way men go who have kept their debts even when they have been slight, the boy, no longer a child, placed the mirror in the small hand of his own grandchild. The child turned the glass in his palms and saw his face, a bright and unsteady thing. He saw, too, the room where stories happened, the shelf full of books with spines softened like well-used prayer books. The photograph in the frame that showed a rooftop in a different light. "Tell me again," the child said, and the man smiled and began the story easy now, a map he could recite with a kind of reverence. The mirror listened as it had always listened, by giving back what it was shown. It did not preserve heroics the way a statue does. It preserved the angle of attention, the choice to point a small brightness into a wrong-headed gaze, the patient work of saving evenings so that nights could keep their sentences. In houses and in letters, and by the iconography of small repeated acts, Donovan's modest faith endured, less a monument than a method. When the boy, grown, careful with the things he had been given, walked once to the plaque in Metz, he stood for a long time and watched the snow of a foreign winter cover the ground. He could have laid the mirror in the museum. He could have written a note to be archived. Instead, he kept it against his chest for a moment, then put it back in its leather, not to hide it, but to send it forth again. He had learned that objects move better when they are let go, that remembering is a circulation. On a small night years after that, the grandchild who had first held the glass sat by a window and angled the mirror so that the moon lay across his palm. He whispered a name, Hayes, Martinez, Donovan, and the sound rolled into the room like a bell. The mirror showed him his own face, the same face that had once been held up to soft light. And in that quiet showing there was a continuation that required nothing miraculous, the simple fidelity of sight. Somewhere else, someone else looked into an unfamiliar case and found, behind the glass and the label and the careful type, an instruction that was not printed but acted. "Will you notice?" it asked without speaking. "Will you turn the light?" The question is modest, and it invites a small labor, to change the angle of looking. The labor does not demand greatness. It asks only for attention. The mirror, after all, had always been about attention. It had bought a handful of evenings, a pocketful of letters, a photograph preserved in the fold of a placket. It had done more than that, too. It had taught a practice. Men and women learned how to bend their sight toward the margins, how to place a small brightness where fear fixed a gaze. That learning, transmitted by hands and words and the quiet stubbornness of objects, turned out to be the kind of inheritance that does not decay. In the end, the mirror rested again on a shelf, its leather softened by use. A child, not yet old enough to know why names matter, took it and looked into it and laughed at a silly face made by a small bend of light. The laughter sounded like a promise. Light moved across the glass, and the glass returned it true. The world kept making edges. People kept choosing where to stand. The small mercies kept happening, one careful refraction at a time.